Hey, so today I want to talk about Fukuoka's natural farming and how you can use it. A lot of people hear about it and generally understand what it is, but ways that you can actually sort of put it into practice because what he says is good in theory. People get a little too focused on the specifics of sort of how he pulled off what he did, in particular, being able to grow crops of rice and barley, so rice and winter barley, successively in the same field without any fertilizer, pesticides, etc. Um, But one thing that's important to understand right off the bat is sort of the natural farming mindset, which is one of being centered in nature. And an important thing to remember, I've been rereading Larry Korn's book called The One Straw Revolutionary, which clarifies a lot of things in the One Straw Revolution. A lot of people read that and think, oh, this seems cool, but how exactly do you start to begin to pull off this kind of thing in your own conditions, whatever those might be? What are the real sort of fundamentals or ways of thinking about problems that maybe people haven't really thought about before? So, a key part of that is to understand sort of non thinking, or sort of stepping out of the usual way that humans approach problems. And in the Larry Korn book, he does a good job of describing the importance of understanding how language affects your ability to look at problems, and sort of what language does as it resides in your brain. And I think this is an important thing. And as somebody that's interested in linguistics, this is something that really was right up my alley, and I think is a really cool thing to understand about what it is to be a human and a language user. And that is that words are sort of arbitrary markers that we put on things in nature. It is only humans who have things like numbers or names for the different things in the universe. Here on Earth, more locally, right? Everything that you sort of see around you. So, our hack in the sort of biological niche is that we subdivide the world, we subdivide nature into what we think are its constituent parts. And in doing that, there is a lot of power because you can then use this system of symbols to abstractly look at the world, and you can make conjectures and have all sorts of ideas about how nature works, right? It will lead you to a lot of discoveries, but a lot of these discoveries are sort of, as Fukuoka might argue, kind of counterproductive. These are the sorts of things that lead people to think that they are smarter than nature or above nature in some way, when what I think everybody really inherently understands is that this is not how it works. Nature is infinitely more complex than we will ever understand, and we should take that sort of as a premise and go from there. So, a key to understanding natural farming is the idea of nonverbal thinking. And this means getting out of sort of your head. This can, I think, help people in lots of other ways, not just in approaching gardening and agriculture, but also understanding what our place is in nature and what is really important as we're here on Earth. And what we think of as a word, for example, these are really just sort of common shorthands that we consider to be, right, something that works, right? When we say, it's hot or it's cold, there is no arbitrary sort of cutoff. There's not a specific temperature at which anyone becomes hot or cold. The same is true of things like colors. These are all just kind of close enough type words for what we really, right? You would show a color to lots of different people. It could be any color, and there's probably going to be a few different answers as to what people think that color is. That can depend on, of course, what language they speak, but also how specialized knowledge of color is to you, right? In what ways are you using color? So an interior decorator could give you a more specific version of a color that's been shown to them, things like that. And so one thing that you try to cultivate in natural farming is the ability to think as part of nature, right? To consider your thoughts not your own, not something that you are creating yourself, but that you are simply part of this bigger whole, right? So instead of subdividing nature into its constituent parts, and this can be things like in gardening, for example, we see people focusing really specifically on certain cultivars or a version of a particular food that they're trying to eat. Whereas in Fukuoka's garden, we see things like daikon radish that have hybrids interpollinating amongst themselves, plants that have become reverted back to their wild ancestry. So big, tough daikon in his garden. And that when you're employing landrace gardening techniques as well, and that's something I'll talk a little bit more about, that there are ways in which you can sort of go back to the wild ancestors of the domesticated plants that we enjoy today, because in many cases there are all kinds of genetic bottlenecks and things like this that prevent us from moving forward with certain breeding projects and things that we want to do, to take these food plants that have been bred for us without the use of literacy, right? Without the use of formal record keeping. The humans have really brought these wild plants really, really far from what they originally were. Think of the teosinte, which is the grain that corn came from. If you saw teosinte, you would never guess that that is where corn came from, because it does not look anything like corn. It has maybe a few kernels on it with sort of a hard coating, if I'm remembering correctly. And they don't, this is not, you would not think this is corn. So corn has been carefully and over many years bred by the Native American people, and that's a huge accomplishment, one of many. And these are the sorts of accomplishments that hide in plain sight, as Joseph Lofthouse says in his book. The domestication of the food plants that we enjoy today is something that is a really serious human achievement, and comes from people who really understood things about plants in a way that Western science maybe doesn't really even fully acknowledge. An example of that is sort of Western breeding of plants focuses on the sort of Mendelian tradition, the idea that you are selecting for certain traits and that those traits have a corresponding DNA marker somewhere. And so you have highly either inbred cultivars that people use, which are inherently weak, lots of problems with those. And either that, or you have hybrids, which come from two inbred parents, but that display hybrid vigor. And that's great, but that is sort of, you can't make your own hybrid seeds in that traditional way, or at least not very easily. But if you employ landrace breeding techniques, one thing that you can do is quite simply select within populations. So another term for this might be population breeding, and saying, I want a taller plant, right? But don't assume that there's one singular gene for tallness, because there's not. And that's the thing, that's a real advantage of this type of breeding, is that you can select for attributes that really sort of only exist in the mind of humans, right? So tallness, for example, right? Tallness, there's not, any specific DNA that is related to tallness. It's probably, right, or no specific DNA marker. This is a concert of genes working together, genetically as well as epigenetically, and that if you want to select for tallness, an easy way to do it is to just plant a bunch of corn plants, for example. Say we're selecting for tallness in corn plants, and then pick the tall ones. Save seeds from those, let those interpollinate, and select again, over and over again, sort of to choose, right, a genetically diverse and yet something that displays the traits that you were looking for. And these are traits that could be all sorts of things, not just tallness. Resistance to pests, right? Resistance to pests is another thing where it's probably not a single gene that is doing a lot of the work there, but that there are processes that go on that are infinitely more complex than humans can understand, but that we are, through landrace gardening, sort of using the computer of nature to essentially manifest what we dream these plants can be. And in a certain way, humans have done this already, right, with corn, squash, potatoes, things like this. And we can really, if you employ these breeding techniques, can do some really exciting things. So to get back to the Fukuokan mindset, one thing that we want to consider is that nature, again, is sort of the baseline. The only reality is nature. Humans create all sorts of perceived realities, right? It's and this arrives verbally to us, right? The fact that, right, simple words, right, words which are sort of just kind of an on and off switch for agreed upon concepts in the universe, right? So we have a word for corn, we have a word for soil, we have a word for the sun, things like that. But that these words do not really attach to any sort of physical reality. And this is true, right? There's no way to, as Chomsky explains it, there's no way to explain a chair to right, a physicist in a way that is sort of definable. And this is true of most words, right? In particular, right, feelings, right? These are things that we sort of agree we understand, that we feel, but there's nothing really universal or tangible about things like sadness, happiness, as well as human-made concepts. The idea of money, for example, is just totally made up. That's not to say that it doesn't have power in the world that we live in, but this is, right, a collective reality that we all agree means something, right? The only money, for example, does not have any real value. It is not a real thing in the world, but we live in a world where we collectively agree to have this kind of shorthand, right? This common shorthand for value. And this is a lot like language, right? Language itself is, right, predicated on the fact that we believe that words mean what they do, right? That go means go and stop should mean stop. That when you say let's go eat something, that means you're going to go eat something, not we're going to go and make something, right? So within this realm, we see that a lot of what humans accept as the reality in their lives is um, really only based on the fact that everybody is sort of agreeing to this same code, right? This is a human-made code and is not nature. This is not something that nature recognizes. This is not something that nature cares about, right? Nature is indifferent to fashion. Good thing, because I'm wearing this gardening hat and a free t-shirt. Google, I'm not standing for Google. They're a bad company. Google is not your friend. No company is your friend. I think you probably understand that. But what we need to do is see the world as nature, see human thought as one part of nature, right? That we are, though, living in a world of a lot of illusion, a world in which there is too much attention paid to things that do not matter, and where people profit off of the labor and skill of those less powerful than them. And this is the world we live in. This is something that humans have struggled with for a long time, but that an important part of the sort of autonomy that Fukuoka sees people building in his sort of utopian vision of what the world can be is people who are independent enough to be able to thrive on their own, and to be able to make their own rules. And this is something that we can achieve through this sort of radical independence. And a big part of that is food, right? We live in a world in which nutrition is one of the most scarce things, one of the most expensive things out there if you're using money to buy it. But it is part of nature, right? Humans have employed beautiful and elegant technologies in their breeding of these plants, these food plants, to help humans thrive and have the time to do things other than worry about if they're going to be able to eat or not. And so I'm here to tell you that this is something that we should work for. I know that in this world it feels like most of the stuff that we work for is bullshit, and most of it is. But what we are really looking at is a radical change. Part of this, I think, is going to have to come from acknowledging that human nature is to sort of treat the world in one way, in which we separate out the whole into its smaller parts, but that we need to understand that this is sort of an inherent fault in the way that we approach looking at the world, because we tend to look at the world and describe it to ourselves verbally. And again, so to go back to the idea of nonverbal thought, we, in looking at the world non-verbally, can understand things and make choices and look at our lives honestly, without ideology, without ideas that hurt us, ideas that are not designed to bring us up, but to keep us down. Here we are. It's good to be on Earth.